Good morning, everyone. And thank you so much, Mary, and the School of Architecture, the Society of Architecture, for inviting me over for this wonderful event. And I'm super excited to be speaking here. I am currently located in Delhi. I work on queer geographies here, but I also had an opportunity to come to UK for a short while for a visiting fellowship at University of Leicester. What I'm going to present today is more going to be a weaving together a bunch of stories. I'm not going to take too much of time. I'll make it a short presentation. But what I believe in is that for communities who are marginalized, stories are all that we have, and weave these stories in different spaces that we come across. We live, we build collectively. So what I'm going to do is use these stories to think about queerness, think about our city making processes, and think about what this city making process can mean for a world making project. If queerness is about world making, right? It's about different kind of imaginations and filling the city and worlds with these new energies. I'll start with a small anecdote, an anecdote about myself, which also will position myself about who am I, what kind of work I am doing, but how that work connects to the narratives that I'm going to build through the presentation today. When I was growing up, my mother would never let me dance. She thought I danced like a girl, something that will be made fun of, I'll be bullied, I'll be probably beaten up by my peers in my school, something that will bring disrespect and shame. Now, respect is a very curious thing. People always crave for it, especially the ones who do not have it or cannot afford to have it. My mother worked as a domestic help, and my father worked as a waiter. So every time, out of necessity, they were out to work, and I was back from school in that one-room house that we called home, which had two beds, a broken wooden almirah, a container for grains, and a small black and white television set, and very little space in between where probably one could hardly make a twirl without crashing into one thing or another. I would secretly steal my mother's dupatta, her scarf, play some Hindi mujra song, and dance. There's a reason I start with this song. It's an old song of a Bollywood film, which is about courtesan cultures. So, so when I was a young boy, imagining in that small room of a house that we lived in and called home, stealing my mother's scarf and dance to this particular song, I would imagine in that moment that I could embody the gracefulness of the courtesan, but simultaneously the abjected figure that the courtesan represents. That I could, in that small room, imagine and fill it with the opulence of the brothel. Most of these brothels, which were in Lucknow, etc., heavily catered and funded by the patrons, which were Nawabs, would be lavish and grandeur. My poverty could not afford me that kind of a grandeur, but my queerness and my queer imagination could help me transform and move from that small little place to that big city in Lucknow, and imagine myself as a courtesan, an abjected figure, as a queer imagery, but also the opulence of the grand architecture where this protagonist is dancing. The reason also why I choose this particular song is that in this entire song, she goes on to say, who are these people who took away my scarf? And she counts out policemen, she counts out the merchant, she counts out all of the various institutions that are in place. We continuously remind us that probably we are out of place. that probably we are doing something weird to this, to the sanctity of the way in which the sanctified logic of the places that we inhabit. We are troubling it. And probably that is what, as queer reimaginings, what we are trying to do is, can we trouble this hierarchical, heteronormative system of spaces to refuel it with energy and impressions, which can help us think about various of these kinds of dreams. Let me come back to England. After one of the gay parties, Bollywood gay nights in Manchester's Canal Street area, which happens once in a month, in one Friday in a month, every month. This party that I was talking about was happening in May 2019. It was the Eid party. Eid has just gone, and that's why I thought, like, let's start with this particular party sequence. But what I want to talk about is the post-party event. Right in your screen is an image of a random elevator. Three of us who were dancing, sloshed, and engaging with the music of this space, the ambience that was created through the Bhangra and Bollywood music, the sleazy, sweaty dancing of rubbing bodies with each other in a club venue that once in a month imagined itself to become Bollywood-esque and could provide and promise to its clientele, which are mostly South Asian, Middle Eastern, queer people, a world of their imagination, a world of queerness in context of the larger spaces of queerness that probably England is flooded with, which is deeply white in its imagination and deeply exclusionary, which come with a universal impulse that, everybody's queer in a similar way. This was a place which was giving an alternate imagination. Just after the party, three of us decided to go back to our hotel room, a walking distance from where the party was being held. We take up into the elevator. We enter, three of us, including me, a Dalit queer person who had just visited England for this visiting fellowship, which was itself a big feat, crossing many boundaries to imagine many different worlds that were denied to the kind of people and the marginalities that I come from. When you think about brown or South Asian people, they often tend to flatten that identity as if everybody means the same. But there are several intra-community differences and which are deeply fractured to the logics of caste, class, religion, and geopolitical tensions that distinguish between who is what and who belongs and who does not belong. In this space, the other two people who are accompanying me was one, a young gay Palestinian boy who was just visiting England for a holiday. Another, a third generation British Asian person that had hardly visited India once or twice. When we enter into this closed space of the elevator, which is almost in no place, but allowing you from the ground floor to go to your third floor room that you have booked, a sense of upward mobility that you could allow, we were joined by a fourth person, a young, equally drunk, Black man. With four of us in this room, this Black person who has just entered looked at us and in what urgency tells us, go back to your country. Now, this sentence, go back to your country, was very interesting and startling for me. And in the very moment, I could realize that how we were read as South Asians at the moment, but also specifically Indian, and the kind of racist crimes that continue to happen in where I live in Delhi. How we keep on hearing how Black youth is targeted and harassed and assaulted, sometimes even murdered. And that kind of anger that person resorted to say that, go back to your country, I could relate to it to that. But what else did this going back to your country meant in the small little elevated space? What did it mean to the third generation British Asian person who probably hasn't been to India in a very long time? What it meant to this migrant Palestinian refugee who's living in some other country and cannot go back to his homeland, given the way in which geopolitical tensions rip apart what is between Israel and Palestine, what it meant to me, but what also it meant to the person who was speaking these words in a context of the larger UK economy, political economy, which is deeply racialized, even if it promises queerness in fragments, in these ephemeral moments. What did this space meant for all of us? I want to talk about what is homeland? How do you create these spaces of home, a sense of comfort, a space of belonging when we try to enter and live life through queerness? In the same city of Manchester, the next day, I had a beautiful moment. It was the time we were leaving for our different directions. The three of us who had come together to party on the Bollywood night. This Palestinian boy took me outside, outside of a restaurant where we're doing brunch, and said, I want to tell you something. It was just an evening that we had met. And he said, I want to tell you something, but I want to tell you in a language that probably you will not understand. But because I want to speak, I will speak, but I'll speak at a promise that you'll not get it translated. He spoke in Arabic for 10 minutes to me, and I could not understand a single word when he was speaking to me on the streets of Manchester. It was deep, super new to me. I could only feel the mirth. Few months later, I requested him, can you audio record the message and send it to me? I want to know what emotion did we stitch onto that street of Manchester that beautiful noon? He recorded and sent to me with the promise that I don't get it translated. But of course, as Gay mentioned, not be trusted. I asked a friend of mine who studied at Sussex at that time to get it translated. She asked a Lebanese friend of her, a queer woman, who translated it, but before she translated, sent it across, she said, I wish somebody was this cheesy to me. What he had written was that in that evening, on that day when I met you in Manchester, I did not know whether I was falling in love with you, but I wanted to fall in love with you. Cities can at one moment remind you of where you come from, what context you come from, how difficultly you survive, like the scene in the elevator. At another moment can stitch for you, weave for you a beautiful memory that is crafted there onto the street, onto the city. When I came to Leicester, the first thing I did was open up Grindr. Grindr gay dating app, which is quite popular in India as well. And I thought, this is the new world. Clearly, I have crossed multiple boundaries, both political boundaries and geopolitical boundaries, but also caste boundaries that limited me, limited my kind for centuries. That I am now in a new world where probably caste doesn't matter. That here I can imagine freedom and queerness in beautiful, radiant ways that otherwise were are impossible desires. When I switched on my Grindr in Leicester, which prides itself to being a super diverse city, for being so ethnically diverse, especially in a context when in 1970s, particularly, a series of South Asian population came via East African contexts to England and settled in streets and neighborhoods in Leicester when it was difficult, where they were persecuted in Nigeria and Uganda, particularly, and other East African countries. The first message I get on Grindr is right on your screen. They're appreciative of my pictures. It's very rare to find a South Asian person on Grindr, even in the cities like Leicester, where there's so many South Asian people to actually use their pictures. I was using my pictures because I had nothing to lose. It was an anonymous place for me. I had come here as a short-time visitor with no stakes in this place. They say, you have nice pictures. But the second question they ask is, are you a Brahmin? And that one moment when this question is asked to me, I'm startled, because this kind of question you would frequently witness in, say, Delhi, in Calcutta, in Bombay, in small towns in India, to asking you directly what your caste location is, and caste being central to the way in which desires are manufactured, desires are transacted. I did not imagine that this would happen here in England. The only identity amongst this blank profile that was writing to me on Grindr dating app was that they had written they're ethnically South Asian. In my first week of stay in Leicester, I got a series of messages on this dating app, all expecting a happy stay for me. But some of them also cautioning me, don't talk to these Muslims. They're all Pakistanis. In the very moment, this space, which was supposed to be egalitarian in some way, promising in another ways, of queerness, a world in England which says, as the global north tries to proclaim, here is where the freedom lies, here is where the queerness can blossom. reminded me that the queerness through which I have come to experience and write about and think through in Indian context is nothing very different from what I'm experiencing here. The experience was new, but seemed very familiar. Leicester is an interesting city. Of the three neighborhoods that you see pointed on your screen, Belgrave Road, Spinney Hills, and Abington have deep and distinctive characteristics to themselves. Belgrave Road prouds itself to organizing the largest Diwali festival outside India. The entire street is you would see vegetarian restaurant flooded with mostly Gujarati Hindu population. Although they might have different temples for themselves, telling that, there are different kinds of Gujarati Hindus which are living in close proximity. Spinney Hills is mainly dominated by Gujarati Muslim people. Abington, which is mostly Middle Eastern population, as well as Pakistani people living in close proximity to each other, crafting just distinctive character to Leicester, a patchwork of these neighborhoods, which say they're ethnically diverse, but clearly segregated in the spatial forms. When I spoke to people who lived in Belgrave, how is the experience of being in England and being queer and being proud of yourself and accessing desires, I'm told that they don't meet people in Belgrave Road. That on Grindr or any other dating apps, which is all geolocative dating apps, when they try to talk to people and they see anybody which is in close proximity, they immediately block them. So while the city in its physical framework might seem spatially segregated, even in the digital landscape, where each subsequent person is the closest person to you, they filter it out by blocking people who live in your close vicinity, in fear that you'd be identified, in the fear that you'd be known, in the fear that your livability in that space would get into peril and precarity. They block everybody, curating that very map to show other people in different parts of the city, but not people in their own parts of the city. Grindr prouds to promise and promises you that it will make sex available to you 0 feet away. That's its tagline, 0 feet away. And yet, the way in which South Asian queer sociality worked in this context was that we do not want to meet people who are much closer to us. Because the closest people to us, given the closely knit way in which most of these neighborhoods come into existence, but also function, their identity will not be able to play out the discreteness through which South Asian sexuality is actually lived and performed. Once, after a London Pride March, while I was walking with the LGSM, which itself is the way in which the Pride gets to be divided in London, lesbians and gays support the migrants, I decided to go to another party, a Bollywood gay night that was happening on the night of the London Pride. It was Club Kali. Somewhere in Soho, it was a moment for me who was deeply ethnically dressed, wearing a traditional dhoti, what I'm wearing right now, and a kurta, which made me feel I'm right out of a wedding, Bollywood wedding scene. I felt this is my community going to be. When I danced there were many people who wanted to dance with me. For varied reasons, for somebody strange like me who was dressed deeply ethnic, I came across as a spectacle among the South Asian community, but also a sense of familiarity that they wanted to come close to. I met somebody there, somebody who lived originally in a small town, small village called Bartley near Leeds. He was visiting here with some friends to experience London Pride, but also to experience what queerness means. Queerness that he can't otherwise experience in his own vicinity, at the fear of being found. I danced for a while. He came to meet me in Leicester. We walked around on the streets of Leicester, a Gujarati Muslim boy from Bartley in near Leeds. We walked hand in hand through Belgrave Road, an image that often the white British tourist photographer would click when it comes to India, to be astonished to see how are men holding hands and walking so freely on the streets. What is this claiming of this city making? Aren't they queer and often painting them as homosocial without any possibility of any sexual tension? and de-eroticizing that image. And here, when we went and walked through Belgrave Road, he had no issues. But the moment we went to Spinney Hills, which is populated by Gujarati Muslim population, and he feared there'd be some uncle or cousin that would see him there, he said, here, I can't hold your hand. I can't walk holding hands with you here in this neighborhood, because what if somebody sees me? What if I'm found? Even though his family is far away in the north, and he was here in the Midlands trying to experience a kind of queer connection that he had developed in another city, the capital of England, in London, at a Club Kali event, which itself was constructed to Bollywood music and dancing for that moment. Many people, when you think about Leicester, can think about queer spaces in terms of this bunch of queer clubs which flock at the edge of the city center. Rainbow and Dow and Dover Castle, mostly white clientele, but also brown people, few brown people who come there. But talking about queerness of the city only through that spaces would then still getting into thinking about queerness through a white imagination. Many people, despite the fact having such rich British Asian population in Leicester, do not live their sexuality on their sleeves, the way in which the Western context promises you otherwise. They go to cities elsewhere in the vicinity to experience it. Birmingham, which is the closest city to Leicester and the second populous city in England, organizes another Bollywood dancing night once in a month, in one of the Fridays, but not the same Fridays when the Club Zindagi is organizing in Manchester and Club Kali is hosting, or Club Desi Boys is hosting in London. It happens in different Fridays so that the same people can be found in each of these party spaces. One Friday each, trying to build and create a world and infrastructure for themselves, which is otherwise impossible, despite the fact that England might boast that we have so many queer, quote unquote, spaces, but queer white spaces. I want to start with talking about a sex club called Bolts. I would have never gone there alone unless I was accompanying with another friend that I had made, a middle-aged white gay man who said, like, we are going for this gay night, Bollywood gay night, but we can also go and experience this sex club. And I had never had that experience before in India. So I said very excitedly, yes, why not? Now, this is an interesting space. Now it is closed because of the pandemic and the lockdown. It had a central bar area, which was probably a site of socialization, more lit. But there were a maze of dark rooms, which was dimly lit. A maze which you could feel with or experience the space through the scent of the semen, alcohol, and sweat, constituting each other, merged with each other to create the experience of the space in it. When I moved through the dark maze, many people touched me. I had an experience which was deeply erotic. When I stood at the corner of the central bar in the lit area, often I found the people stealing glances but trying to unsee me. In that space where there were only 4 other non-white people that one could see, I felt deeply isolated, deeply alienated. After a while, there was one boy that one could see at the entrance of the dark maze. I looked up to him. He looked up to me, and we stealed some glances with each other. And with two more sips of beer down my gulp, getting all the confidence that I could gather, I reached up to him and introduced myself. Super excited. He had sharp features, fair complexion. Now, as I mentioned earlier, brown is a very amorphous category, right? It is obsessed with fairness, and it has disdain for anything which is dark complexion, and therefore deeply rooted in anti-blackness. So the experience that we had in the elevator was not at all surprising, because that's what South Asian identity otherwise builds through, a sense of anti-blackness that's woven through us in our narratives that we grew up with. I talked to him. I introduce myself. I tell him that, I am a queer geographer and interested in thinking about spaces through marginalized queer identities. And Sometimes some map spaces like Grinder, he's excited. He stops me in that moment and says, let me show you something. He's a young Kashmiri boy who had come to England 6 years back. 2 months before this particular event in the sex club in Birmingham, there was an incident that particularly tensed the geopolitical climate in the South Asian context. The boundary making of South Asia, which is deeply a remnant of the colonial, the colonial remnant, the way in which our countries are fractured. A bomb blast had taken place where 40 paramilitary officers were killed in the Pulwama region of the controversial part of between India, Pakistan, and China, Kashmir. This Kashmiri man, while in England, on a gay dating app Grindr, gets hate messages from other South Asian people who identify themselves from a heritage that comes through India, saying, Muslim, terrorist, go back to your country. He's perplexed. Here, he has come to make a home. Where should he go back to? It was not just one singular incident, but I came across many of other Kashmiri queer men who would negotiate sexuality both as exoticized and fetishized subjects, but deeply fractured when it came to such geopolitical tensions. That phobic and the erotic could all both be living in the same body. That how Islamophobia is woven through the way in which geopolitical tensions are working there, the national boundary making and the hatred towards each other across the borders between India and Pakistan, the caution that was given, don't talk to Muslims, they're all Pakistanis, to what was being experienced here or shared here in a space which was deeply white, where only 4 of us were non-white, but a sense of community and belonging could be produced through this communality and marginality. Later that evening, I saw him again in the Nightingale Club, where the Sathi Bollywood Gay Night happens, one of the Fridays of where I had come with my friends to actually dance and feel at home. I had not danced in a long time since coming to England, and I wanted to dance. Here, the space was constructed through Bhangra music, given the richness of the Punjabi culture that populates Birmingham. There was Bollywood music as well. There was drag performance, and there were trans queer people from South Asian heritage all populating this club space. But I also heard a lot of queer men complaining that there are so many heterosexual people who started coming to these parties recently. South Asian heterosexual people. Now, South Asian people are suddenly strangely, and as any ethnically minoritized subject, is painted as the homophobic other. And therefore needs to learn the ways of the queer reimaginations for learning from the Western, the ways in West imagines queerness to be. Many of the South Asian heterosexual couples who come here have nowhere else to go where they can relish through a community identity that is produced through music and sound and dancing. So this street in Kent Street, which is usually on any random day, mostly populated by white queer expressions and flamboyance, on this one evening on Friday, turns South Asian, turns colorful, tells us about the various boundaries that one is trying to contest and question that, and what other images that people feel. There are many parties that happen in England, from Club Kali and Club Desi Boys in London, to Sathi in Birmingham, to Zindagi in Manchester. Now, when I visited these places, I was told that as a visitor, they were excited to find that, as an Indian, you're coming, you must be enjoying and experiencing this kind of freedom for the first time, to be able to dance freely as a queer person. And the way in which the Orientalist fractal knowledge works, I had to tell them that if you were to come to Delhi today, I can take you 4 dancing nights in a week, not just wait 1 for the entire month. What is the ways in which we imagine our spaces to be. What are the kinds of power systems that we are trying to contest when we are reimagining our worlds? From the Bollywood dancing that recreates the club space for an otherwise a regular club space into something which could proliferate a sense of community, a sense of belonging, but a community which is also simultaneously fractured, that can remind you of the various other marginalities that the blanket South Asian identity, their identity tries to hide in order to flatten the queer imagination. The way in which queerness is flattened in the Western context, the white imagination in the South Asian context, in Indian context, as upper caste, upper class, consorting with this white image, trying to aspire like the global gay aesthetic. Queerness, for many, lives in these ephemeral moments, in these joys that are produced to collapse in a little while. The party space or a little eye glare exchange, or a beautiful moment on the streets of Manchester. Cities are complex. Our queerness is messy. When we negotiate our cities through the messiness of a queerness, we create messy geographies. I want to end by saying, as researchers, as activists, as artists, to think about when we create these messy geographies, there cannot be neat ways of knowing how queer worldings are done. That for messy geographies, we will need messy methodologies. We'll need to question ourselves and recreate and reimagine our worlds. I'll stop here. If you have questions, comments, anything that you want to ask, I'm right here. But thank you so much for generously listening to me.
Thank you so much, Dhiren. That was an incredible talk. I guess, does anyone in the room have any questions? Some of my own, or Tom? Well, I guess when you approach talking about these spaces in your research, when you're kind of talking through the different spaces within Leicester, those three very distinct regions, it was wonderful to hear you talk about it, but when you're kind of putting that into sort of formal research, how do you go about describing that sort of messiness? Because you speak about messy methodologies, but what does that mean when you write? Like, how do you approach, that?
For me, as a discipline of geography where I come from, conventionally speaking, we are obsessed with creating neat categories. And we want to create the queer subject as a neat subject that can be analyzed. Right? But our experiences of queerness are deeply fractured. The Kashmiri gay boy in Bolts in Birmingham is a desiring subject in that space, despite knowing he feels alienated and lacks community and belonging. But he aspires, despite the fact that he might have faced vitriol from other queer South Asians on dating apps, does not mean he abstains from being on these spaces. When somebody has blocked other people in their own neighborhoods in order not to be revealed, does not mean that they are not living their queerness in the spaces. The way in which they're negotiating queerness through this kind of map-making, cartographic practice of excluding certain bodies from their maps or the radius of desire, is also a negotiation of messiness. So often I would walk along with people I was talking to, desiring, building through friendships and intimacy, building dialogic relationship. I was making a relationship with the city itself. What it felt walking on Belgrave Road, what it felt walking on Spinney Hills, what it felt being in Evington. What does it mean to going to Rainbow and Dow and Dover Castle and just sitting there by yourself? Because you wanted to feel queer. You wanted to experience the kind of queerness that the West promises. So when I say queerness is messy and these spaces are messy, I mean to say that on one hand, the South Asian identity tries to produce itself as one homogeneous identity in order to contest the deep racialization that imprints this body and maps them within the ethnic diversity of the country and its complicated colonial histories, it is within itself so deeply fractured. So on the same Belgrave Road, there must be some dominant caste queer person who would otherwise not say in the English context, does not believe in caste, but would ask me on the dating app, are you a Brahmin? But just looking at that I was draping a dhoti. Or when somebody who has just recently migrated to the city, what did the city mean to them vis-a-vis somebody who had been there for 3 generations? How did their queerness interact with queerness of these people who had recently come here to seek future? Or were just ephemerally present there momentarily for short duration of time as visitors, as tourists, who would come in and go out without deep stakes in it. For me, it was my own journey into coming to England and crossing the borders, but also thinking about what are the various other borders that the same neighborhoods have created, which are imaginary, but necessary in order to live out those queerness. I don't know if I answered your question well.
Yes, and even more so, yeah. I mean, when you're kind of talking to people, and do you ever kind of ask them to physically draw these sort of spaces? Do you ask them to draw even sort of the venues where the club nights are held? Is that a process that you use?
Yeah, because one of the ways in which I do is like, because each one of us carries the city in our minds, right? And that city is the city of memories. Therefore, we might in detail draw about certain areas because we remember and live those spaces much more intimately compared to other areas that probably we just pass out because we cannot, or we have a certain kind of hostile relationship with those areas. So I asked many of the people I interviewed and walked with to draw me their cities. And it was spectacular to see that while living in the same neighborhoods, how their maps differed drastically. That when they talked about the cities that they knew, but the cities that they desired, or where they desired, whether the regular people that they would hook up with or had sex with were lived, were all created such interesting overlaying narrative of the city, which can't be mapped using conventional tools of cartography through this ArcGIS and ERDA softwares that are trained to us, because these maps are very queer maps, right? You would suddenly come across a particular street which has every detail, and each place has this series of memories by different people that is overlaying onto it. And there are other places that you have no recollection of, and you feel like that is what queerness does to the city. It does not give you a homogeneous city. It resists that homogeneity. It embraces that messiness. It embraces that overlaying ways in which we come to embody the city in our everyday practices and lay out memory by memory onto it to create this rich archive and thick mapping that the city produces for itself. I don't know if I answered it well.
Yes. Does anyone else have any questions? Also on Zoom, people feel free to put stuff in the chat if you do. If not, I guess we can wrap up for now and maybe take a short break. I think Martha is up next, but yeah, we can kind of spill out into the garden. It's quite sunny here. Thank you so much, Dhiren, for joining us.